The ancient Israelites believed that in order for their nation to survive, it was very necessary to have law and order. And to that extent, the scribes, the lawyers, so to speak, and the many of the priests started to interpret the laws of Moses. And their interpretations grew bigger and bigger and bigger and more until there were finally 55 volumes. For example, it says that you should not walk more than a mile on the Sabbath, because they were trying to figure out what would distinguish how much walking would you do when it would cease to be recreation and become work. And so they came up with you could walk half a mile. And then they decided they better make it 3/5 of a mile so that you wouldn't accidentally disobey the law. They got into so many of these kind of things, it became a huge and heavy burden for the people. The prophet Malachi was condemning them for this in the first reading, and Jesus in the gospel, they're still doing the same thing. They wanted to look like they were obeying the law. We all want to look good externally, but inside is what really matters. And people can see through the exterior so many times, can't they? And here's what's happening with the Pharisees and the scribes in the gospel. It says that they widened their phylacteries. Do you know what a phylactery is? It's a little box, and inside of it, they would put quotations from the scriptures, and they would wear the box on their forehead and on their arm. And it would remind them of the scripture readings that were therein, supposedly. So they would make bigger phylacteries so that everybody would see that they really have the scriptures on them. And it says that they would lengthen their tassels. No, not tassels. Yeah. And the tassels were the fringe, on the end of their clothing. On a prayer shawl, they would have all this fringe. Well, the longer the fringe represented the 10 Commandments. And so by looking at it, they were to be reminded of the 10 Commandments. But they wanted to have bigger and longer tassels that looked more ornate, because then everybody would think that they were obeying the commandments. So the Lord was really calling them to task for these kinds of things. It's not just we have to look externally, and we all like to look good, for sure. And sometimes we do things just to get around the law ourselves. In 1980s, when seatbelts became law in Italy, in the city of Naples, there was a man who just did not like having to wear a seatbelt. So he had T-shirts made that had a 4-inch wide black band right across the front, so that when policemen drove by and saw him in the car, they would think that he was wearing a seatbelt. Well, that's fine, except that band on his T-shirt was not going to save him if he was in an accident. But he looked good, though. He was following the law externally. Or like at college, it was Parents' Weekend in a college, and in the local student newspaper, the local tavern had an ad, and this was the tavern where most of the college students spent their free time. And the ad said, "Bring your parents to lunch on Saturday. We'll pretend that we don't know you." Well, the chaplain saw the thing and he thought, well, he'll have one up on them. So on the bulletin board in the college, he put, "Bring your parents to Mass on Sunday and we'll pretend that we do know you." Externally, we want to look good, but internally is what really, really matters. And that's what Jesus is saying here. The people became so discouraged by the insistence on these minute tasks of following the law that they just started to leave the religion. They couldn't do it. It was too hard. And Jesus is saying, don't do that. You're putting these terrible burdens on the people. And they wanted to be recognized as the teachers. And that's why they said, don't be called rabbi. Or Jesus said, don't be called rabbi. Only one is your teacher, and that's Christ. And yet they are called rabbis even today. But the point is that they said that parents would bring their children into the world physically, but the rabbi, by teaching, would be a father in faith. And so again, they were putting themselves up in an exalted position to be like God. And the Lord caught them on it. The Lord is your rabbi. The Lord is your teacher. And don't call anyone father, the same thing, to be called father. This was they were trying to come across as though they were the very fatherhood of God. And Jesus was saying, no. Some people read this and say, well, then why do we call priest father? And why do we call our dads father? Well, we all understand what that means. But here, it was a whole different sense. What St. Paul tells us is that the law that we have to follow, and we heard it last week from Jesus, there's only 2 commandments summarized. Love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. That summarizes all the law and the prophets, he said last week. St. Paul tells us that what we need to do is listen. He describes for us what that kind of love is. If we have faith so as to move mountains but do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give away everything I own but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love lasts forever. That's the love of God. And if we have these qualities in ourselves interiorly, it will certainly be seen as a sign of God's presence to others around us, not because we want to be noticed, but because we want to give recognition to Christ. So let us this week look at our own selves and see how authentic are we in living our faith, not just following the rules, but living it in our heart.